apologies. I wanted to make sure to record to my computer and not the cloud so we can upload it to YouTube. So I've got my notes file, which is great. I've got my day one demo here, which is great. Let's start talking about JavaScript. And actually, I guess this really should be renamed day 2, shouldn't it? So let me go ahead and do that now. I goofed. Renaming a directory on the command line takes a couple steps. I'm just going to do it here to be lazy. And now if I type git status, yes.
I was going to say real quick, just because we command save inside of VS Code, that doesn't necessarily mean that Git is getting that stuff. That's where that Git add and Git push and all that good stuff comes into play, correct?
That's a great question. So the way that Git works, so I mentioned, I think the ls command lists all the files and directories inside our current working directory. If I add this flag -a, that shows what are called dot files. There's a convention with the terminal, with the shell, with the command line, where any file or directory starting with a dot is sort of hidden from the normal ls command, and it's normally used for configuration type stuff. So this .git directory is a normal directory, but it's like, that's why you don't see it show up in the Finder and might have to do ls-a. Any change I make inside this demos and notes directory, that is my Git repo in this case, Git will track. And could you ask your question again? Because I lost my train of thought halfway through there.
Yeah, I was just saying, if we're working with the file inside of VS Code and we command save it just so we don't lose anything if we exit out,
right?
It's just going to save it right then and there. It's not actually going to push anything to Git. That's where the Git commands come into play and we push it back or whatever. Okay.
Correct. Yeah. Yeah. Like I'm working with this file in VS Code. The question is like, where does this file live in the file system? And the way that like we set up VS Code, where I walk through kind of opening the directory, means that all the files that you're working with should be living inside your Git repo. So like, yeah, I save this file. Like I'll go ahead and add an exclamation point here. If I type git status, well, I moved, let me do this quick change and then I will demonstrate it. And thereby using that git add dot command, I added all the changes, the directory that I deleted and then renamed. And Git is smart enough to figure out that that directory got renamed. I'm not sure why the git commit message pushes all that stuff out. It looks like it wants me to configure something that I don't have to worry about configuring right now. And then on push, I'm sending those changes up to GitHub. And I'm typing git status all the time. And that's kind of what you want to do to just get more comfortable with Git and familiar. And yeah, to answer your question, if I make a change to my file, and then I save my file, if I type git status, Git sees that that file has been modified. And it's telling me, hey, this file has been modified, but like we have not saved that modification in Git at all. So you're correct. And then with add, again, I think the analogy I would make is like we put the cookie on the baking tin. And now Git says, hey, this change that I've made, it's on the baking tin. We're ready to put it in the oven and bake it and commit it. And whatever changes we've had here will be committed. And now that change is committed.
Perfect. Okay. Awesome. So I felt like I'm beating a dead horse there, but I just had to make sure.
No, it's a great question. Definitely not beating a dead horse. I know Git is a pretty complicated tool. It is simply so common in the workplace, and every software engineering job you'll be applying to will basically expect you to have a degree of comfort and familiarity with using Git and GitHub, that we introduce it from day one. That said, it is a complicated tool. It's not like obvious. And to be honest, the command line Git stuff is not necessarily the friendliest either. We'll show some graphical programs that you can use to interact with Git, but getting familiar with the command line really is something that is just almost universal in the programming world. So it's good to see this stuff. And it's only, I think, really because of time why we kind of have to introduce Git in pieces. Towards the end, around, I want to say like week 11, we have like a whole day workshop that dives into like more of the internals and advanced stuff with Git by this DevOps guy, Chris Ware, who works at DRW, who's volunteered with us for a while, and it's amazing. Chris, yes, sir.
Yeah, Adam, just to follow up with Kenneth's question, I mean, do you on the source control on the left side of VS Code, obviously recognizes the changes that haven't been synced. Since you didn't bring that up, was that something that are there pitfalls with using like the graphical source control in VS Code vice using the command line to check the status, etc.?
Yeah, that's a good question. Honestly, no, there aren't pitfalls. If you feel more comfortable using the VS Code source control tab, then I would say go for it for now. The big advantage of the Git command line things is that it's universal. Like you might be working with a different editor one day that's not VS Code. And also, to be honest, it's just another way to help people start getting more familiar with the command line is to introduce this stuff. But again, especially now and with these assignments and stuff, if you're finding that using this source control tab helps make your life easier, then I would say go for it. But the reason we focus on the command line is just because some degree of comfort with the command line is pretty universal among programmers. So it's just a really important skill. All right, let me dive into JavaScript. JavaScript is one of the core technologies of the web, as you folks know. It was created by someone named Brandon Ike when he worked at Netscape in 1995. And it was created because back in the day, like if I go to Wikipedia is a good example. Back in the 90s, websites were, we call it static. You looked at text and images, and those texts and images had links. But even this pop-up that we see right here, that's JavaScript. Anytime on a website you see something that's interactive, it's almost always JavaScript that's doing that. Browsers have gotten a bit more sophisticated, so there's a little bit of a blurry line, but as a general rule, that's still the case. The internet and the web was way more popular than people realized. And there was a huge push among companies to figure out how can I make websites interactive to do all sorts of things. And some people might remember Flash games from a while ago. Some people might even remember like Java applets from a while ago. Basically, in the early 90s, there were a lot of people trying to figure out how can I run a program in a website and not just display unmoving static text and images. And just to talk more about what JavaScript does on the web, even like this drop down and the fact that when I type, these search results in real time are being sent out to like Google's cloud and filtered and sent back. That's all interactivity and behavior that is JavaScript running on this web page doing all this work. And in 1990, none of that existed. And I don't know if we can get a Google HTML view. I don't know if that exists. There is with Gmail. And then the real revolution on the web was you started to see things like Gmail, like Google Maps. Like this is a whole program running inside your web browser. The browser is now like a programming environment. And that's all powered by JavaScript. In the early 90s, though, there were a number of competing technologies to try and create this how we were going to stick a programming language in a web browser. JavaScript was the one that kind of ended up winning for some reason. It's a bit of a weird language, to be honest. Does anyone know? I was talking with someone about this. There's another programming language named Java. Is there any relationship between Java and JavaScript?
Yes.
No.
Other than the name.
No.
Oh,
It
the
names it.
name and some syntax.
I think it was all like
Yeah, there's
Well, originally
commercial,
they
yeah.
used JavaScript as the name because Java was so popular, and they kind of
Yeah.
wanted to bank off that.
Yeah, exactly. So Java and JavaScript are two totally different, unrelated languages. Languages, kind of like real human languages, because programming languages are like this like very weird specific form of an actual language. Languages have families. Like back in, I think the 60s, there was a programming language named A. Someone created a programming language named B, and then someone created a programming language named C, and C kind of took off. There are other languages that created, but C was really successful. And so then when other people were designing programming languages, they used a lot of similar syntax to C. So you will see, no pun intended, if you look at Java and JavaScript, if you just look at the code, there are bits that kind of look familiar. And that's kind of because they both do share, in terms of their influence, some of the C family of languages, but they're totally different kinds of programming languages. And I missed who said that, but yeah, JavaScript was named JavaScript for marketing reasons because Java had just been created. It was this very popular language, and Netscape thought they could get companies to buy into this new JavaScript language if they made it sound like it was connected to Java somehow. There are two kinds of programming languages. There are more than two, but essentially two big categories. Programming languages like Java, you have to do something called compiling, where you take the actual code, like when we see the code that we write, we run it through a program called a compiler, and it spits out another file. That is, with Java, it's called bytecode. With a language like C, it might spit out assembly code that's called a binary. It's something that the computer can actually read and execute. A computer doesn't understand the code that we see, like the JavaScript code. Like, let me go ahead and just make a JS file here and just put in a quick hello world. The computer doesn't understand this. We understand this. When I run this command node, which I'll talk more about in a moment, the node program converts this JavaScript into something that the computer can understand. With languages like Java, it happens in two steps. And I apologize. With JavaScript, it happens in one step. Because JavaScript was created for browsers, in any browser, you can go in Chrome, you go to View and Developer Tools, and you can click on JavaScript console. And most of you are probably familiar with this. You can run JavaScript in the browser. The browser has what's called a JavaScript engine. Michael, yes, sir.
I was just trying to figure out what's the difference between that and Node.js.
Yeah, that's a great question. And let me actually dive right into that. So every browser has what's called a JavaScript engine. And I'm just going to pour myself. And what the JavaScript engine does, so unlike a language like Java or C, where you run one program to compile your code and then another one to execute it, with a language like JavaScript, it all happens in one step. It's called just-in-time compilation. Python is like this, PHP is like this, Ruby is like this. We'll talk about dynamic languages where you can create a variable, but you don't have to define the type of that variable. Like I can create a variable named X, and I can change not just the value of that variable, but the type. Here, the type of the value of X was an integer, the integer 5. Here it was a string, hello. Here it was an array with some stuff in it. In what's called a static language like Java or C, or I want to say this old language, Fortran, other static languages are escaping me. If I created a variable, and then I tried to reassign the value of the variable to something that was a different type, like now it's not going to be some other number, but actually a string, then Java wouldn't let me do that. This would throw an error in Java or in C. And without going into it too deep, the reason is because of how our computers store data. Like at a very low fundamental level, the computer will store a string differently than an integer. A computer will store an array differently than it stores a string or an integer. And that's really fun to talk about, but a little bit out of scope for today. So every browser has a JavaScript engine. JavaScript is a dynamic language. We can change the types of variables all we want. What someone did, and every browser has a different JavaScript engine, by the way. Safari has its own JavaScript engine written by Apple because they own Safari. Microsoft, I'm pretty sure, has its own JavaScript engine written by Microsoft. Sorry, Internet Explorer. Chrome by Google has a JavaScript engine called V8. And because Google is a pretty great engineering company and all about the web, and they were creating these technologies like Google Maps and Gmail, they decided we want our browser to just have the fastest JavaScript engine anyone's ever seen, because that makes it easier for people to use the internet. So they'll search Google more and they'll see more ads, and then Google makes more money. The Chrome browser's JavaScript engine is called V8. Let's see. I thought they would have mentioned it here. They mention it when you look at the information about the homepage. If you search Node.js, I would have thought they said it right on the homepage, but they say right here, Node.js is a JavaScript runtime built on Chrome's V8 JavaScript engine. Basically, his name was Ryan Dahl, around, I want to say 2000. got the idea of basically ripping the JavaScript engine out of Chrome. And most of this was open source, which was why it was possible. And let's use it so that we could run JavaScript on my own computer or on a server. Without going into too much about the JavaScript language, there are certain things about it that make it good for being like sort of a hub. Like if you had to write a real-time chat server, JavaScript actually has some language features that are good for that. And so Node was named Node because the idea is that it would sort of be at like the center of maybe handling a bunch of different kinds of communications, like a sort of a traffic cop kind of program. So Node.js lets us run, it lets us run JavaScript outside the browser. And if I use the command line which command, that tells me where this program Node lives. It tells me it lives in this directory opt/homebrew. As Mac folks know, Homebrew is a package manager for Mac. The point being, Node is something that we have to install. And what Node.js, and on the command line, the name is just Node to make life easier for typing, does, is if I just hit Node and enter, I have something just like the JavaScript console on my computer. Forgot closing parentheses. I can create a variable. You can do all the kinds of things that you can do in the JavaScript console. If I pass the Node program an argument, and that argument happens to be a JavaScript file, Node will, it's called interpreting that file. It will turn it into, it will compile it. Essentially, it's called just in time. It's not really real time, but it compiles it right away into a form that the computer can understand, into some sort of assembly or binary code, and then it runs it. And then Node also has a lot of like built-in things that help with interacting with the command line and the terminal. And so that's kind of why we get for free that we can print this output to the terminal. But as those of you saw yesterday who tackled the def gramma problem where you had to add some input, it's a little bit more of a pain with JavaScript and Node.js to handle receiving input from the terminal. So that covered a lot of ground there, but just to recap, Node.js is a JavaScript engine that is set up to be used outside the browser, like on our computer or on a server in a data center somewhere. And that's what lets us run JavaScript in our computer. Does that make sense to folks? Awesome. And let's see, there was something else I was going to say. Yeah. Let me just check in with the class, actually. How are people doing? And what's on people's minds? Okay. Cool. Let's keep rolling. I'll organize my notes a bit better before I throw them up after class. Let's talk more about the JavaScript language. So you'll hear us talk about code and data, and you'll hear us talk about primitive data types. Basically, like in a JavaScript program, we can define some variables, and I'll talk more about the different variable types and things later. We can do things with them. we can create a function we can run that function. And there's a lot of different things going on in here. Like up here, we have defined a variable. We've given that variable the value of an integer. Here we've performed some sort of operation on that variable. In this case, we've added something to the value of the variable. We've changed it. Here we have, it's called defined a function. And a function is a block of code that we can reuse in other parts of our program, and also conceptually helps us organize things. Here we have called a function and passed it an argument. And I'll talk more about functions and arguments in a moment. I know that a lot of folks have seen this. What I want to point out here is that there's a lot of different things going on, even in this little program. We have a function, we have this console.log command, which is another function that's sort of built in with the JavaScript language that lets us print information to the terminal. We're defining a variable, but we have some data and we have some code, right? We have this variable and it has a value of 5. And we could say that that's sort of like the data in our program. And there's this sort of core distinction that you'll see when talking about programs and writing about programs and thinking about programs between data and code. And we see it even with computers every day. Like we have a text file and we have a text editor. That text file is data. That text editor is a program. So with a programming language, I should put a plural here. There are certain types of data, because the way that programming languages work and computers work is that they have to know what kind of data they're dealing with in order to know what to do with it and how to store it. So the computer has to know at some point that X is an integer and not a string. So these primitive types are like sort of the core data types of any programming language that kind of like everything else is built on. So JavaScript has strings and it has numbers, and it can have different kinds of numbers. It can have an integer. Or what's called a float. Which is a decimal number, because the way that the computer stores decimal numbers is different from the way that it stores whole integers. It can have a Boolean value, which is, you know, basically true or false. There was I think the name of the mathematician who came up with that kind of, I think there was a logician named Charles Boole, I want to say, and that's where that term Boolean came from. It's from some mathematician's name. We can have an array, which is a list of other variables in a specific order. And I'll walk through these examples in code in a moment. In JavaScript, a primitive type is null, which means no value. And I believe in JavaScript, a primitive type is also undefined. And to show what that looks like, let me just very quickly I'll start adding these here. Let's say we did let z. I've defined this variable with the let command, which is a built-in feature of the JavaScript language. I'll talk about variable definition in a minute, but I haven't given it a value. And if I use this console.log command to print the value of C, I'll comment this out so that it doesn't run. I'm pretty sure it's going to actually print out undefined. Yeah. So that's an actual primitive data type. Kevin, yes, sir.
Sorry, unmuting. I had a question just real quick. When I was taking the notes, are Booleans and arrays considered types of a number value, or is that only integers and floats?
Yeah, that's a great question. They're not number types. Oh, I have that all.
Yeah,
I
that's why I was
apologize.
confused. No worries.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I apologize for that confusion. And Kevin, thank you for letting me know that. Yeah, I will definitely goof a lot during lessons, so please just let me know so that we can correct it for the class. But actually, this is a good check-in point to just see what's on people's minds and what questions people have. Jaden, yes, sir.
So real quick with let, I just wanted to clarify. So when you're like let variable or var or whatever, it says you can reassign it but not redeclare it. Redeclaring it is just saying, hey, this equals this, just a single equal sign. And then reassigning it is like if you're doing something with like a loop or something, right? And you can reassign it to something via that loop. Is that what that's referring to?
I think so.
I just wanted to know the difference between reassign.
Wait, can I
and
answer? I think
declare.
I understand.
Yeah, go for it. That's a great question,
so
by the way, Jaden.
Declaring the variable, as far as I'm aware, is when you use let, var, or const. And then reassignment, we would be if you say you're using I as your variable, iterating it over a loop, every iteration you're reassigning I to be up one value higher, lower one value. You're not redeclaring it because it's not let I equal +1. It's just reassigning.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's what I was thinking. I just wanted to double check that my thought process on that was correct.
No, for sure. That was a great explanation. And actually, I'll demonstrate this in code in just a moment. And I'm going to add it to our notes too. Declaring a variable tells the computer that some variable with this name exists. We don't have to give the variable a value when we declare it. Assigning a value to a variable actually gives it a value. And Icarus, thank you. That is a great analogy, and I am totally stealing it and putting it in the notes. Yeah, and this goes a bit into how computers work. There's something called a namespace. Which I'm not sure if I can correctly define it off the top of my head, but all the names for all the variables that exist in a program. And I think the analogy I might use is like the telephone book for a city. Like if you look something up in a telephone book, there's only one phone number that can go with a name. Not that telephone books exist anymore, but we all have seen them. And it's the same with the computer. The computer, like when we create a variable, that's a unique name. Like we can't have two different things there. So with a program, it creates what's called like a namespace, because as our programs get bigger, and a great example of this actually is, let me go ahead and do this. I've created this variable X up here. However, inside this function, there's also a variable named X. And what I've done is in this function definition, so a function is a block of code. You can pass what's called an argument to a function. And in JavaScript, you can give a function as many arguments as you want. You don't have to use them all. And that's how you move data around between different parts of your program. And that way, like I can call this function and pass in different data. And I can have the same bit of logic that I reuse in different places. And this is obviously a very simple example. But again, I want to talk about the distinction between code and data. And what we see here is like, hey, I've got a variable named X here and another variable named X here. How does the computer not get confused? And the answer is something that's called variable scope. Essentially, like a programming language will have an understanding of like different scopes or blocks. Like, and you could think about it like for the telephone book for two different cities, maybe you could have two different businesses with the same name in the different telephone books for the different cities. That's not the best analogy. However, the point that I want to drive home is that like we declare this variable up here, but then inside here, we're declaring a different variable, but they're in different scopes. And so the program knows to track those things differently. Like actually a good example would be here's another program. Without getting too much into like how you kind of import and move data around between files, like JavaScript we'll talk more about it later, but basically for free, JavaScript will kind of like scope stuff to different files. I shouldn't actually say that because that's not entirely true. In fact, that can be a huge problem. So let me take that back. Node.js does some of that for us. I think a good example would be like if I did this, like we're now sort of overriding this value. Actually, let me pause here because I think I went down a little bit of a rabbit hole. And my guess is that most folks feel pretty comfortable with the basic idea of a variable declaration and a little bit about scope. Corbin, yes, sir.
So if you have the same name for something in your global scope and local scope, would the global scope interfere with what's named in the local scope?
That is a great question. Let me write out an example of that right now. I believe what happens is the local scope overrides. And it gets a little tricky with JavaScript, to be honest. Let's see what happens here. If we say like let X equal that. Yeah, Kenneth, I see your comment about like, so function hoisting is a bit of a different thing. Oh, I need to run the function. That would help. And let me comment out this stuff that we don't want for the moment. And I'll comment that out. So what happened here? I created this variable X in the global scope for my program. And let me move this up a bit so that's easier for us to see. Fun fact with VS Code, if you hover here, you'll see like this little arrow where you can like collapse functions as they get bigger and stuff. We created this variable in the global scope. We declared it in the global scope. We assigned it a value. We reassigned it a value again. And then here in our local scope, we declared another variable with the same name. And JavaScript decided, and then we ran the function. And JavaScript decided, hey, I am going to prioritize the local scope variable. Over here, though, if I now and Kevin, yeah, that's a great question. Like, our locally declared variable only exists inside that function.
Can you show the local scope changing the value of a global scope variable?
You cannot directly, let's see.
If you
see
remove
it
the
will
let
us
on
do
line
that.
8, wouldn't that change it?
Yeah, it probably would. And this is where JavaScript kind of sucks. Yeah, that's exactly it. Yeah, that is a good example. Let me think about how to add that to the example so we can see both of them here. I'll write another function. Yeah, that's a great question. And Mariko, thank you so much for sharing that visual. That's amazing. If you want to maybe throw that in the Sierra Resources channel, also, that would be awesome. And when that happens, if like a locally declared variable overwrites the global value of something, well, that's the term we use, like overwriting it or overriding. Overwriting or overriding.
Oh, excuse me. Would the result be different if you move the console log X above the function, line 6, maybe?
It's a great question. So, and by the way, in VS Code, if you highlight a bunch of stuff and then do command /, it will comment it all out. And then if you highlight it again and do command /, it will uncomment it. So let me make this a bit smaller so to see if we can get everything in here. Let me bring this stuff up here. And I'll just do that. Cool. So we've got, and I'll get rid of this actually, because that's not too helpful for our example at the moment. Actually, I'll let that live. So right now, this is kind of going back in time. We declare this variable globally. We declare another variable locally. And we see that there are two different variables from the program's perspective. In the global scope, there's a variable X that exists. And then within the local scope of this function here, there's another variable named x. And it doesn't matter what the order is for our console logging. With this overwriting example, you are correct that the order does matter. The reason being that, like, we declare this function, but when we declare this function, JavaScript doesn't actually execute that code and make those changes. So let's see here. And in fact, let me go ahead and just add some comments here. In JavaScript, there are two ways to sort of combine or concatenate strings. One is simply with the plus symbol, or I'm sorry, with the console log statement. There's two ways to do it. One is with the plus symbol. The other is inside a console log statement. You can just use a comma and a space, and it will print out whatever is after it. And I should talk about string concatenation in a minute and go through a bit more of our language fundamentals. And it looks like I may have done something that, there we go. I'm not sure why the program hung there for a moment. So we declare this variable, we give it a value of 5. We reassign the value, we increase it to 10. And note, by the way, if you haven't seen this before, it's perfectly okay in the same line to use the value of a variable and reassign it. When the computer is looking at this line of code, it goes through it line by line. It says, oh, we're going to reassign this variable x to some new value. We are going to reassign it to, to whatever its current value is, plus 5. So it does this stuff on the right side of the equal sign first, and then assigns the output of that essentially to what's on the left. So we create that variable, we declare it, we assign a value to it, we reassign it. In this local scope example, we saw how we created another variable with the same name, but because it's scoped inside a function in a different namespace, it's fine and there's no conflict. And we saw that with those console log statements. Over here, we're just printing out the value of our global variable again. Over here, we run this function which does overwrite that global variable. And this, by the way, not every language lets you do this. Like Java might not let you access the global variable x inside this function. I would have to check, but this is a decision of the people that made the JavaScript language. The fact that inside the scope of this function, we can access global variables is a feature of the JavaScript language. And so we do that overwriting, and then we print it out, and we see that right here. And so I forgot who asked the question, but you're absolutely right that the order does matter here, because here we print out our global variable and it's fine, but here we run this function, we execute that function, which does do that overwriting, and now the value has changed. And Kenneth, you make a really good point. are 3 ways to declare variables in JavaScript. There's really 4, but there's let, there's const, there's var. So back in the day, in the browser, in the JavaScript console, so in JavaScript, you can declare a variable just like that. You never ever want to do that. There are weird scope implications that happen based on if you do that or this. Adding the var keyword there actually matters. Once our JavaScript programs get bigger, we'll have what's called modules essentially, and like most of the work we do won't be in like one big global scope. And so I don't want to go into it too much now, but I want to do a very brief history lesson that until like maybe 10, 15 years ago, these were the only ways that you could declare variables in JavaScript. Then more recently, changes to the language were made with this keyword let and this keyword const. And I'll show what let does in a second. But Kenneth is absolutely correct that with the const keyword, when you define a variable that way, you can't reassign the value of it, though there's some limitations to that I'm not sure I want to go into too much. Michael, yes.
So when we're talking about global, if you had a function within another file, would global still transfer over?
Yeah, so that's a great question. What we're going to see, I misspoke. The short answer, the problem is that JavaScript itself like doesn't have a lot of concept of scope. You could have a bunch of different files, and if you run them all, stuff gets thrown into a global scope. Yeah, that's a question we'll come back to later because it gets tricky. It's different depending on if you're using Node.js or the browser and depending on how you're using Node.js. The short answer is that JavaScript by itself doesn't have great scope, and a lot of kind of features with Node and newer JavaScript language features have been created to manage that. But back in the day with your JavaScript code, you did have this problem where there was this one big global scope and people had to do all this crazy stuff to work around it. With variable declaration, the most important thing is you really don't want to use the var keyword at all. You always want to use let or const. And let me go ahead and show some examples of this. We've already seen this. Oh, and I already used X, so let's just use Z. So I don't know if you folks saw, but there's a little squiggle here. And in fact, it's VS Code is helping us. There's a little red squiggle that's telling us that VS Code is seeing a problem in our code. And then I'm trying to redeclare a variable Z that I must have declared somewhere else. And in fact, I declared it up here where we didn't define it. And VS Code is telling us, hey, like there's already a variable named Z within this scope. So let's just call this my var. We'll call this const var. Actually, we'll name that let var. So we've got the let variable and the const variable. And when I run this program, so actually there's a couple good things to point out here. So when I run the program, the way that the JavaScript engine steps through this, and Kenneth, I see you're mentioning the book Eloquent JavaScript. That's a great book. The program starts from the top of our file and goes through line by line and is executing it. Here's the variable we declared, all the const stuff, and it prints all that out and it keeps running until it hits a problem where the JavaScript engine says something is not right here and not following the rules of the language. And then it throws an error. And it tells me what file and on what line in that file that error happened. And it gives me some helpful information. When you're reading an error, I would pay more attention to, usually it's maybe at the top of the error where there's a bit of a description of the kind of error. All this stuff is called a stack trace, where it's going through, I gotta be honest, I'm not even sure what it's going through here. Some things internal to Node.js that we don't really need to know about or care about. So part of the art of error messages is learning what to ignore and what to pay attention to. But this tells us the problem, that we try to reassign a const variable and it doesn't let us to do that. Does anyone have any questions around, I know I've been touching on a lot of ground, but with this stuff, I just want to kind of check in with folks. Cool. How are people doing? Is this useful? Is this review? How are we feeling?
So the constant right here is pretty much immutable, and then the other one you can change it.
Mostly. Unfortunately, JavaScript is a very weird language. And someone mentioned this in the chat, and I think I'll show this right now. So I was talking about primitive variable types. And you can think of like primitives as sort of like the building blocks that everything else is built out of. And one of those is an array, which in JavaScript we create using the square brackets. Yeah, we're just checking on time. We're going to take a break in a moment. I think I'm going to just demonstrate this quickly and then we'll break. So this is an array in JavaScript, which is a list of stuff. It can be anything. In a language like Java, a statically compiled language, an array could only contain one type of thing. An array would have to have only integers or only strings. In a dynamic language like JavaScript, we can mix it up. But an array is I believe it's a JavaScript primitive. I'd have to check. But what's different about an array is that it contains other variables, right? Unlike, say, a Boolean or a string. Yeah, and I apologize. An array is actually not a JavaScript primitive. I got that wrong. I'll update my notes. It is a very core part of the language that we use all the time. And in fact, I kind of proved myself false here because the whole idea of a primitive variable is that you can't break it down into anything else. Yeah, like it technically an array is an object in JavaScript, and I think I'll talk about objects after the break and talk about that then. But the idea of an array is it contains other variables in a list in a specific order. And we can talk a bit more about the kind of where arrays come from later, but they're stored differently in memory in the computer because they have these other variables. So for better or for worse in the JavaScript language, you can do some weird stuff with const and arrays. Like if I do this, I believe I will get an error. Like I can't just totally reassign this. Yep, and if I scroll up, I see that error assignment to const variable, da 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 da. But within arrays, arrays have a bunch of built-in functions. One is a function called push. And in fact, I'll just we'll assign that to a value and we'll console log it. And let me console log the const array like that. I might have push wrong here. Yeah, I don't want to use push. I want to use pop. Pop is a function we use to get rid of something from an array. And so now, even though this an array is a constant, I believe this program is going to run. Yeah. So let me quickly show what just happened, and I'll clear this and talk about it. So it's these three lines right here that we care about. I created an array using the const variable assignment operator. We used the array pop method to stick something out, to pop a value out of the array. And we printed that value out just to see it. And then we printed that same const array. And it's different now because we got rid of something in it. So for these more complex variable types like arrays and objects, using the const variable assignment operator doesn't guarantee that they don't change at all. What it does mean is that I can't just totally, yeah, I don't want to go into like talking about like references and things like that, but basically this variable name is connected to an array and there is something in that array. Const doesn't do anything about the contents of the array, but it does make sure that this variable name stays connected to that particular array. Like I can't just go ahead and do this. That will still throw an error if I run this right now. And we see that assignment to constant variable. So that was a bit of a digression. The good news is that this is not a major problem for most of the JavaScript stuff that we'll be doing right now. It pops up a little bit later. But I didn't want to talk a bit. JavaScript is a bit of a weird language. So yeah, I figured now is a good time to check in with folks, see what questions people have. It's getting close to lunch. I'm thinking we should maybe take a 10-minute break. And then I think I do want to talk a bit about objects in JavaScript, because that's the last sort of complex data type that we haven't seen as much of. And I think that'll be a pretty good jumping off point for this afternoon. Before we take a break, what's on people's minds?
I had a quick question about So when I was learning JavaScript and everything, it seems that trying to integrate it with like HTML and CSS and all, or I guess just really HTML, it seems to have a whole different set of rules of really what I'm doing. Like it just seems so much different. What do you like? Do you know what I mean? Like with like document dot this, like it seems to be
Yeah.
totally different. Is that something where I just kind of get used to like learning how to solve problems, and then you also have to learn how to completely, do the full stack? Is that kind of the whole difference?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And the short answer is that with the tricky thing about JavaScript is like when we're using JavaScript with the browser and on the web, there's a lot of different technologies that we're working with. So it's actually more complicated than it first appears. We'll learn about it later, but the browser itself, like, there's a lot of ways that we can write JavaScript to interact with and control the browser. Like, let's see. I can't remember something off the top of my head, so I'm not going to try. But essentially, like the browser itself is a pretty complex piece of technology. And when we're writing JavaScript that's running in the browser, a lot of what we're doing is interacting with the browser itself. And like when you see like documents, something, location or get element by ID, or all these things, there are ways for interacting with the browser and the HTML page in the browser. So it's like, there's the JavaScript, there's the browser, there's HTML, there's the CSS, and they all do kind of get jumbled together. The more you do it, the more you get comfortable with it, but it is complex, and it's because it's actually several different technologies. The nice thing with Node.js and writing JavaScript is we're outside of that browser environment. Like there is no, I don't know, like if I tried to do something like document onload here, this should throw an error. And it should say something like document is not defined. Yeah, because we're running this document without going too much into it is something that the browser gives us.
So this is something that's like, even like if you're using like Python as the backend or something, it's just a different way to use that language with integrated with a different language, right? It just makes it, the verbiage is a little different.
Essentially, yes. What we will see is that a lot of the power of programming is using libraries that other people have written. And those libraries themselves are so complex that they're their own things to learn. And with JavaScript in the browser, we're essentially using a lot of like complicated libraries and functions that other people have written to interact with the browser. When we're just writing JavaScript like this, we don't have to worry about any of that stuff. With Python, we'll see that happen later. Like we'll learn Python and then we'll start using this web framework called Django that's used to build what's called the backend of websites that does stuff like handle form submissions and save stuff to databases. And Django is complex enough that there's just a lot to learn there. So I think what you're talking about is really the complexity of like using libraries and other programs that people have written for us to use and kind of combine together.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Thank you. How are people feeling on time? Do we want to do a short break or keep rolling? Press on. Yeah. Okay, I want to do that too because I want to make sure that we do cover some of the core like JS stuff because I have been jumping around a bit. I think I talked a bit about arrays. I think I want to continue talking about maybe briefly arrays. I think probably, yeah, arrays and objects. So let's look at how we interact with arrays. So I have this array. When we talk about an array, we talk about an array having elements. Like, let's say, like in an array, the value of an array is that it keeps everything in order. And what I will do is I'm going to replace these values with strings that will help us recognize that. And this shows us the order. And with arrays, we talk about what's called the elements or the items in an array, the things inside it. And we'll talk about what's called the index of an item in an array. If something is, the reason we start with 0 is because of how computers work. Essentially, it also gives us an extra single digit to play with. Like you can have 10 things in an array, but you start with 0, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And then that gives you 10 indexes. So the index is the name, is how we talk about the position of something in an array. So I'll say 0 it sometimes. I'm not sure if that's the best way to describe it. And we use these curly brackets, and that's how you access an item in an array. And the value of an array is that you can access anything in it. When we talk a bit about data structures in a future class, we'll learn about some data structures where you maybe can't access everything inside of it. And a data structure is basically a fancy word for a more complex variable type, or something that we've written, a bit of code that we've written to manage other variables, often primitives. Like an array is a data structure, an object, which I'll talk about in a moment, is a data structure. You'll learn about like tree data structures, and you can actually like write your own data structures. Like using the JavaScript language, you could write your own functions that you could use to create an arrays from scratch. So we'll talk about accessing the different parts of an array, and then I'll just go ahead and console log these out. And I want to check in with folks. Does that make sense? And do people have any questions about like the idea of an array and that it has elements and how we get them? And if I run my program now, down here we see printed out just the 0th, the first, the second thing in the array. We saw here how to get something, how to change an array by getting rid of the last thing. Often we'll want to add something to an array, and we call it pushing it.
The second element should be 2, right?
Oh yeah, I didn't change that. Thank you so much. Yeah, beautiful. Thank you. Third.
Sorry, shouldn't
This
the
works.
second element would be the in position 1, the third element would be in position 2, right? Well, okay.
The third, no, you're correct. The third element is in position 2.
So the constant second element should maybe read third element. I get what you're saying. I see it. Never mind. I got it.
We
No,
all
it's
start
all
at
good.
0.
Yeah, no, you raise a good point because it does get tricky how we talk about this stuff. Like we will talk about like the first thing in the array or the second thing in the array, and often we're talking about like starting at index 0. It's a little confusing, but a lot of stuff in programming ends up like starting at 0. So like a lot of the times, like if we're talking about arrays, like we might just say like, yeah, if we say like grab the first thing, the second thing, you're right that we really are talking about index 0 because it ends up where we're so used to just saying first, second, third. Jamie, you might be right that this should be rewritten. For the moment, I think I'm going to leave it as is. Also, so it's just really explicit about how indexing works. And then with arrays, we add something to an array by what's called pushing. And the nice thing about with console log using this comma is that JavaScript will do the work of printing out that array as a string. And yeah, that didn't work. That's oh, I think it's like this.
Hey Google, turn off the reading light.
Oh, there's some. That is okay. There's some other syntax for pushing to an array that is escaping me at the moment. But
Is it
to be
a
honest-
-1
Uh,
for the index you put there to push forth?
that might work. We're not going to use that in most cases. I think in terms of just an example of how to use it, I think I'll just stick with just using the push function. Because that's pretty commonly used. There's some shorthand that's escaping me at the moment, but we'll come back to it. I think I want to switch gears and talk a bit about objects because these are pretty core to JavaScript. So in JavaScript, you basically have primitive types and functions and objects. Like JavaScript actually has a command called type of. So I could do type of const array. I could do, and type of is a built-in function. So I would use it like this, like type of something equals type of hello. So you can combine stuff, you can combine logic together. Like instead of say doing that in 2 lines, I can do that in 1 line because this is a function that's going to return an output. And when JavaScript reads this code, it gets to this line, and then it looks inside these parentheses and says, oh, I better execute this first, figure out this output, and pass that into the console log function. And if we look down here, we see these types. It's a string, and it's a string. And now if I do like the type of array for my const array, this is going to be a little interesting. type of, let's see how good this is. It says that the type of this array is an object, which seems a little weird. The truth is that an array in JavaScript is kind of an object under the hood. And most things in JavaScript, except for primitives and maybe functions, are objects under the hood. And we can check right now for a function. Let's look at one of our, I think, let's make sure that that's, yep. So that's the name of function. By the way, something cool when you start using code more and stuff in VS Code, if you hover over something, it gives you information. If I right click on this, it will take me where in my code to that array is defined. And there's a keyboard shortcut for that too. So it's really helpful to start getting used to that stuff with VS Code. And if we run this now, yeah, a function is its own type in JavaScript. You've really got kind of functions, primitives, and objects. And that's pretty much it. So objects are sort of like the building blocks of all these other things. Unlike with an array, you don't access objects like the values of what's in an object by order. An object is basically a collection of stuff. And I'm going to use an example here from the curriculum. I veered a bit from the lesson itself, but the lesson itself, I think, will also be a good guide. Yeah, let's do it like this. So in JavaScript, you'll see curly braces used for what's called like blocks, for stuff that's related to scope. Like in this object, if I give this object a property called X, that's scoped to this block. Up here where we defined our functions with these curly brackets, this is a block that's scoped to this function that we created. I haven't demonstrated like if and else statements. I think folks are pretty familiar with those. But as you know, those use curly brackets too. And again, there's some scoping there. And actually with the let variable, let is scoped to like if statements. And that's not as critical, but it is a nice thing to know. So like inside an if statement, you can use the let operator to create a variable that might have the same name as something in the global scope. And it'll just exist within that if statement. But so here we've created an object. And that's where we use these curly brackets. And if I console log the object using the comma, which will print the object out as a string. Then down here, we see it kind of prints out this information. Maybe we want to get the user name. And we can do user.name. And so we use what's called dot notation to access properties of objects. We talk about an object having properties. For a property, we talk about a key and a value. The key, as in think about like the key opens a door, it opens a lock. The key is what gives us access to the value. There's another way to access properties on an object. We can use this bracket notation, which looks similar to working with an array. and if we know the name, or rather if we know, yeah, it gets tricky. If we know the name of the property, then we can put that in as a string. And let me make sure I haven't painted myself into a corner here. Yep, that works correctly. There's a lot of interesting things we can do with objects. Once we have an object, we can add another property onto it this way. Like we could do user dot favorite food equals chicken. We could do user favorite color equals blue. Did someone have a question? How are people feeling about this? And what questions do people have? Because I want to check in on this. And objects are kind of like the big, they're like, we use them all the time for all sorts of things in JavaScript. And they're a little different. Like Python doesn't have an object. It has something called a dictionary, which is very similar in that it's like these key value pairs. But objects are kind of unique to JavaScript and get used all over the place. Michael, yes, sir.
Can you have an array within an object?
That's a great question. You absolutely can. That is a great question. You can have an object within an object. So here's an object. Let's say maybe name. We'll call it first name. If you wanted to, you can even define object properties as strings, though you won't see people doing this unless there's a specific reason to. Then maybe what's something that's an array that we could add here? Maybe we'll.
And please, what did you should not do, and why should you not do it?
Yeah. So when you define a property on an object, you see how here we can just type out the name that we want the property to have. Here, I'm actually typing out a string as indicated by these single quotes. Instead of, say, doing it like this. And this should work just fine, unless I've totally lost my marbles. And let me test that out. And as you folks notice, I run code a lot. And one of the cool things about programming is that you can test your ideas by running the code. So if you're ever not sure if something works or how it works, just write a bit of code and run it and see what happens. So this works just fine as a way to define a property on an object. Generally, we won't do that because it confuses VS Code for one reason, potentially. You'll notice the coloring is a little different. It's extra typing. It's a chance for us to make a typo, and it's just unnecessary. There are certain cases where maybe you need to do it that way. You can also, not to go too crazy, but object property key name equals, let's see, first name, last name. I could create a variable. And I could use that variable to define an object property.
Recording in progress.
And so here on this object, there's this property city of birth, but I didn't explicitly define that in the code. That comes from interpreting the value of this variable. So you can start to do you can very dynamically create object property keys and names. And that we do all the time. But this one with the string, there's less reason to do that. So I would just avoid defining object property keys that way. Does that help, Jim? There's
Yes,
not
that
like
was,
yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, for sure.
I
Like,
hate typing anyway, so I don't want to type more than I have to.
totally. It's also like there's certain, like, let's see, like VS Code gives us lots of great auto completion. Like it will figure out with this complex object that it's got a user property, that there's a first name. It's actually figured out all of this great, which I'm kind of amazed by. But several years ago, it might not have like figured out the string property or the dynamically figured out property one as well. So with VS Code, by the way, like definitely getting comfortable with like the kind of like autocomplete features that it offers as a way to explore things. Like for an example, with our array that we made before, what I think was called const array. So in JavaScript, when you have an object, it's a little confusing. Like you have object properties, but an object property can also be a function. And we haven't talked, I haven't gotten as much into functions as I need to for function definition. And I think maybe to wrap that up, let me just give an example here. Let's add something that's an array. Maybe
Favorite number or numbers.
favorite, yeah, favorite numbers, of course. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Those are my favorite numbers. Maybe let's create a function called catchphrase. In fact, let's add a last word. So this is a function where I can call it and pass an argument and it'll print out how cool, and then whatever string I pass in as the argument. And here, inside here, I could make an object property called catchphrase, though I think, it's because I didn't add the comma. So now I could even do complex, and I think we'll call this just me. Or actually, let's do this, user info. That makes more sense. User, now I can do user catchphrase. And if I run this, there we go. So I would error, identifier user has already been declared. Let's just change this to user account. And let's change that here to user account. And note, I can take nice advantage of, again, VS Code auto completion to help me avoid typos. There we go. And so I ran my code, it prints out all this stuff. Out here, it prints, how cool, dude. And what we did is we created a function, we defined a function. Here in our object, we assigned the value of this property to be a function. And it doesn't have to have the same name or anything. We could do it like this, and it would work the same way. And then here, we accessed that property, which happens to be a function, and we called it. So this is kind of one of the amazing things about dynamic languages like JavaScript. And it's also where it gets a bit more complex. And also, to be honest, exactly how this works, that we can like pass a function as a value, is is a deeper subject than it seems. Like we'll do it a lot in JavaScript, but not every language works that way. Like over here,
Adam, one of the cool
Uh,
expressions that I had seen was to, you capture a person's first name and their last name, and you can use another key to describe their company email address without ever actually typing it in. Or you
Oh.
could have a function that calculated their days old.
yeah, that's a great one. Like here, let's write a function, call it get company email. And let's say we pass it some user info. And we do this a lot in JavaScript where we kind of just assume that we know what the shape of this object is. Because let's say first name is going to be user info dot, or I'll just call it user dot, what did I call it? Info, yep, that first name. And you don't have to write the code out this explicitly. I'm writing it out this explicitly for learning purposes. So it's a good example for everyone. And then actually, this is a great example. Thank you so much, Jim, for mentioning this. There are two ways where we could create the email. We could do it like this. First name plus last name plus at codeplatoon.org. Or we could do it like this. Where, because we use this backtick, we can use a $sign and a curly bracket to combine stuff into a string. When we combine different strings into another string, that's what we call concatenation. I would have to look up the etymology of the word, but I'm sure it goes back to Greek or Latin for some kind of combining. And it doesn't matter which one of these variables we return. Let's just return the email another way. And now if over here, I do add an email, I can do get company email for user account.
Adam, the example I had seen was they simply conducted the string concatenation in the email key in the value portion. And then I would argue that the function to calculate a person's days or weeks old would be the better use of the functions how I had saw it.
You mean like in here have get email is a function that
Not even
then,
a function. They just conducted the string concatenation.
So
underneath. Go ahead.
Oh no, please.
So underneath the info portion is where I had seen, like, for you got the first name and the last name, and then you would say email colon, and then the string concatenation.
I see. So I'm not sure that that works in this specific case because the challenge is like inside an object. I'm not sure that like inside an object, we can get direct access to other properties of that same object.
Okay. So I would just,
Yeah.
that was really cool. So.
Yeah, if you could share the example, I would love to see that. I could be wrong. Let me do a quick Google search here to see if there is a way to do that. Yeah, so there are a lot of tricks to do that. Like if the first name is defined outside, or a lot of the times what we would do, to be honest, is we would have like a function named like create user accounts. What we could do is after we define this object, we could totally do user account dot info dot email equals we could do it this way. Which is very similar to what you were saying. The difference being that inside the object definition itself, I don't think you can access object properties in JavaScript because JavaScript doesn't know that object really exists yet. But once it's defined, we can do it very much that way. And often you'll see like helper functions that kind of do all this in one go.
I'll see if I can find the example and maybe share it later.
Yeah, I would love that. Thank you. Nick and Michael, and then we should break for lunch.
Yeah, I just had a quick question about down towards the end of the program, you had declared a variable as a constant, but it pointed to another variable. Does that prevent you from changing the data type, or is there a reason for doing that?
Oh, over here?
Yeah, a little bit above that, you did const last name equals user.info.last name. So I could change, yeah, last name to whatever I wanted. So is there a reason why you're declaring it as a constant, or does that do anything for it? Like if I were to change that to let instead of const,
of const? Yeah, that's a great question. So for the way we have this code written, it doesn't matter because I'm not modifying this variable. And it really doesn't matter right now, especially as we're learning JavaScript. Like towards the end of the class, as you start writing much larger, more complex programs, what you will discover is that changing the value of a variable, what's called mutating it, it can get complicated, essentially, like with a complex logic. So like as a habit, a lot of the time, what you'll see with JavaScript is that people will use const all the time. And then if it turns out that you need to modify the value of a variable, you'll just change that to let. It also communicates a little bit to anyone reading your code that like, we're not expecting this to change. It's a bit of a deeper answer there because there's some styles of programming that sort of like depend on that, but that's the short answer. And for now, it's not that big a deal whether you use let or const. I'm not sure, did that get at what you were asking about?
Yeah, it did. Thank you.
Awesome, for sure. Yeah, no, great question, Nick. Michael, yes, sir.
So this might be outside the scope or come up later, but you were just about ready to use this dot and then what you needed it to do.
Yeah.
Where would you use that?
Yeah, totally. So that is a good question. I'm doing a quick Google on my other screen to make sure that I get this description right. No pun intended. So yeah.
I'm looking over my old notes. Do you use those in classes then?
Yeah, I don't want to go there with JavaScript. Yeah, the short answer is like, yeah, the this keyword is something that we will see I think with Python, when we look a little bit at classes in JavaScript, we'll see that too. It comes from the world of object-oriented programming where you create classes. And the idea is you create a class, and then when you're inside your class definition, that's how you can refer to different parts. And that's kind of what I was trying to do here. I really wanted to do like, you know, email was like this dot info dot first name plus, you know, I don't know, this dot info dot last name plus at codeplatoon.org, but that doesn't work, unfortunately. Like this, the idea is that this refers to sort of like the scope that you're working in. However, in JavaScript, this does not work. And what this object refers to is a little fuzzier, and we don't use it as much. You will see it a bit more with classes, but in JavaScript, but even classes in JavaScript are weird and aren't real classes. They're actually like simple objects. And so generally speaking, we don't use the keyword in this JavaScript. We don't use the this keyword in JavaScript a lot. I thought that might be a way to do what Jim was describing, but I don't think that will work.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, for sure. Like, yeah, so the short answer to your question is like, if I did use JavaScript right now, like here to use this, it gives me some sort of access to the global scope. And I'm not sure exactly like which parts of the global scope we would get access to. On my other screen, I'm looking at the Mozilla developer docs for JavaScript. And part of the big part of the reason why I've forgotten this is because it is not used nearly as much in JavaScript as in other languages because of the quirks of how JavaScript works. Yeah, good question. What other questions do people have?
This is Yaz. I'm trying to understand what you did on my phrase, catchphrase. I didn't see where you declared the function, so I'm kind of like confused.
Totally. Yeah, the catchphrase. Yeah. So this is something that's a lot trickier than it seems. There are a couple ways to declare functions in JavaScript. I haven't shown you some of the newer ways, and we'll see them later. Really, for today, using this way, the sort of original way with language works perfectly fine and is very readable. So here on line 94, we declare a function. JavaScript is special because a feature of the language is something that's called first-class functions. You can pass a function as a variable or an argument. So
yeah, where I was confused is that you didn't use the parentheses when you assign it to my catchphrase.
Exactly. And the reason is because what I would do is something like this. Like you don't see this in Python or other languages, though there are certain ways of doing it. Here, we are not executing this function catchphrase or calling it. Like, you know, I think what you've often seen is that, right? Where we would be executing the function. Or if it returns something, like let me modify it a bit. We'll do this where it has a phrase. And it will console log the phrase. And then we'll also return the phrase. Let's execute the function and assign its output, what the function returns. to a variable. I'll just use const. So here we call or execute the function. We're passing in an argument. Here we're not passing in an argument. JavaScript is okay with either one, actually. And the output of this function we assign to this variable. And let me run the code really quickly, both to make sure I don't have any typos and also to demonstrate it. So right here we see I ran the function. I didn't pass an argument. It's undefined. I ran it again. Here's kind of the special case that I think is new to people. And we don't do this a ton, and we don't need to do this a lot right now in JavaScript. Over here, I am not calling this function catchphrase. I am telling JavaScript, hey, this function, connect it to this variable. This variable points to this function. It's like a nickname or an alias for this function now, because I can actually call that function with this other name now, and it's the same function. Did that help a bit? I missed who was asking that
Yes,
question,
you
but
did.
did that?
Yes, it was yes.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, yeah, that's a great question. And this is something that's special about JavaScript. It has a lot of other interesting implications, but the term is having when a language has first class functions. And we do the same thing here, by the way, where we assign that function to a variable, where again, this is almost like an alias or a nickname for this function. And then we can call the function by another name. And it's super interesting. We're not going to need to do it a ton right away. That's a really good eye because that is something that's pretty novel about JavaScript. So yeah, we covered a lot of ground here. This was awesome, folks. I want to stop because we should break for lunch. Let me stop the recording.